Before we dive in, if you love epic tales of war, strategy, hit that subscribe and like button, turn on notifications, and join our growing legion of warriors. Now, let's begin. Caden Hayes had never been a man of adventure. He was a linguist by trade, specializing in xeno-languages, a field that had gained immense importance after humanity made first contact with alien civilizations. But unlike the diplomats and military personnel who explored the stars, Caden preferred the quiet hum of translation software and the challenge of deciphering languages no human had ever spoken before. That was before he was assigned to Zira 7, a remote outpost on the edge of human-explored space. Zira 7 was an unusual place, a planet recently colonized by humans but already inhabited by an indigenous alien species called the Valari. They were humanoid in shape, but distinct in every other way. Their skin shimmered in hues of violet and deep blue under Zira 7's twin suns, and their eyes, larger than a human's, reflected an intelligence beyond words. The Valari were cautious, enigmatic, and had an unbreakable rule. They did not speak in human presence. This was why Caden had been sent. Humanity needed a breakthrough in communication, and he was one of the few with the patience to attempt it. But, in the 6 months he had spent on Zira 7, the Valari remained as silent as ever. Except for one. She called herself Ryla, though Caden had no way of knowing if that was her actual name or a rough approximation of her true title. Unlike the other Valari, who simply ignored the humans, Ryla had taken a peculiar interest in him. She would watch him from a distance as he worked. Sometimes she'd tilt her head when he spoke, as if studying his words. Other times she would let out a series of soft clicks, gestures, or body movements that he suspected were some form of Valari language. At first, Caden assumed she was merely observing, but as time passed, he realized something deeper was at play. Ryla thought he didn't understand. She would mutter to herself in her native tongue when she assumed he wasn't paying attention. She'd roll her eyes when he attempted to decipher basic Valari phrases. And on more than one occasion, she made sarcastic remarks in her own language, usually when he was frustratingly close to a breakthrough, but ultimately failed. Caden couldn't let her know the truth, because he did understand. At first, it had only been fragments, loose words here and there, a basic comprehension of their sentence structure. But over time, he had picked up more than he let on. He had studied every interaction, every subtle vocal inflection, every shift in body, language. And now, after months of patient observation, he understood Valari speech with near-perfect accuracy. But Ryla didn't know that, and Caden was going to keep it that way, at least for now. What would happen if she realized? Would she be angry? Embarrassed? Would she stop speaking freely around him? He didn't have the answer. But one thing was certain. The moment she found out, her reaction would be priceless. Caden knew he was playing a dangerous game. Understanding Valari speech was one thing, but keeping it a secret was another. If the Valari learned he had cracked their language, it could change everything, maybe even end their fragile relationship with the humans. But Ryla made it impossible not to listen. She had a habit of muttering to herself, especially when frustrated, whether it was a failed human attempt at communication or an interaction with her own people. She would vent under her breath, thinking no human could understand. It was during one of their routine meetings at the Zira 7 research outpost that Caden almost gave himself away. Ryla stood across from him in the open-air marketplace, surrounded by Valari vendors. Zira 7's twin suns bathed the scene in an eerie glow, casting long shadows of both human and Valari traders haggling over goods. Caden had been trying, unsuccessfully, to negotiate for a Valari artifact when Ryla sighed audibly. By the stars, he is hopeless. Does he even have a brain? Caden nearly choked on his own breath. He had to bite his tongue to stop himself from responding. Instead, he forced himself to look confused, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to decipher the sounds she had just made. Ryla groaned and crossed her arms. Humans, she muttered in Valari. They think they are so intelligent, yet they cannot even grasp the simplest of words. Caden swallowed his amusement and pretended to jot down notes on his tablet. But she wasn't done. Maybe I should just teach him like a child. This is a rock. This is food. This is me losing my patience. It was getting harder and harder not to react. The moment was interrupted by another Valari, an elder of their kind, who exchanged words with Ryla in a hushed but urgent tone. Caden could make out pieces of it. You spend too much time with him. He is no threat. That is what they all say, before it is too late. Caden pretended not to understand, but the words haunted him. Were the Valari hiding something? Why were they so reluctant to communicate with humans? And why did Ryla defend him? Later that night, Ryla found him at his usual study spot, a quiet corner of the research facility where he spent hours analyzing recordings of Valari speech. She stood at the doorway, arms crossed. "You're persistent," she said in English. Though her accent was thick, Caden smiled. "It's my job." She exhaled sharply, the Valari equivalent of an exasperated sigh. "You are never going to understand us, you know." He tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Why do you say that?" "Because language is more than words," she said. "It is meaning, culture. You will never understand the Valari heart." Caden resisted, the urge to smirk. If only she knew how much he already understood. But instead of arguing, he shrugged. "Maybe you're right." She studied him for a long moment, her deep violet eyes narrowing. Then, as if deciding something, she spoke under her breath in Valari. "At least he tries. That is more than I can say for the others." Caden's heart pounded. She didn't know it yet, but he had just won this game of words. The next few days were uneventful, with the usual routines at the outpost. Caden spent his time buried in language analysis, working late into the night to make sense of the fragmented Valari speech patterns. Meanwhile, Ryla continued her casual, sometimes mocking observations. She seemed to enjoy baiting him, like a cat with a mouse, fully unaware of the fact that Caden was anything but clueless. But the tension was growing. Ryla was becoming more unpredictable in her behavior, more cryptic, more direct, and somehow more familiar. One evening, Caden found himself alone in the research lab when Ryla entered without knocking. She did this often, as if testing the boundaries of his patience. This time, her presence felt different. He could sense something brewing beneath her calm exterior. "You're quiet tonight," Caden said, keeping his voice neutral. He continued to scroll through his tablet, pretending not to notice her sudden change in posture. Ryla paused, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Is that a problem?" Caden smiled. "Not at all. Just a bit unusual." She tilted her head. "You always have so many questions, don't you?" "Not really," he replied, letting the silence hang between them. "But I do have a few." Her lips curled into a faint smirk, but there was something guarded in her expression. "Go on, then." "How do you feel about humans?" Caden asked, his voice soft but curious. For a moment, Ryla didn't answer. She studied him as though deciding how much to reveal. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I think you are all like children," she said, almost a whisper. "You have potential, but you are reckless. You do not think through your actions." Caden resisted the urge to smile. This was new, her vulnerability. It felt like a glimpse into her true thoughts, and it made her seem far less untouchable. "You don't think we're capable of understanding?" he asked, leaning forward just a bit. She shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with his probing. "No," she said finally. "I don't. Not like us." There was a long pause. Caden felt his pulse quicken. The challenge was in the air. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Then I suppose you won't mind a little test?" he asked, his voice more confident than he felt. Ryla raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "A test?" Caden nodded, keeping his gaze steady. "A simple one. If I pass, you'll have to admit that I understand more than you think." Ryla crossed her arms. "And if you fail, then I guess I'll go back to being the clueless human you believe me to be," Caden said, a playful glint in his eyes. Her lips quirked into a tight smile, and for the first time, Caden saw something other than mockery in her gaze. "Very well. What is your test, human?" Caden leaned back in his chair, hands folded calmly in his lap. Then he spoke a word, one word, in Valari. Ryla froze. The word was complex, multi-layered, and context-dependent. It had taken Caden days to figure out, but he knew now exactly what it meant. It was a word the Valari used to describe a bond, not just between individuals, but between two beings who shared a unique understanding. The word carried a weight of meaning, a reverence for the shared experience of life. When he spoke it, Ryla's expression changed. Her eyes widened and her body stiffened. You understand?" she whispered, as though the air had suddenly thickened. Caden nodded slowly. "I do." For a long moment, Ryla said nothing. She just stared at him, her mind racing. It wasn't until the silence became unbearable that she spoke again. "How did you know that word?" Her voice was no longer mocking, but something far more genuine, a combination of awe and disbelief. Caden stood up, feeling the tension in the room shift. "I told you I've been listening and learning." Ryla's lips parted as if she were about to say something, but then she closed them again, as if processing the realization. Caden could see it, the gears turning in her mind. This wasn't just a game anymore. It wasn't just about language. It was about trust. "I didn't expect you to understand," she said, more to herself than to him. "I didn't think you ever could." Caden took a step closer, his voice low. "But I do. And now we can finally start talking. Really talking." Ryla's eyes flickered with something Caden couldn't quite place. Then she gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Let's see where this goes then." The days following their exchange were unlike anything Caden had ever experienced. The silence between him and Ryla had shifted from one of unspoken tension to something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. Ryla, who had once been so distant and seemingly indifferent to him, now engaged in conversation with him, not just with words, but with a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. Caden had no illusions about the magnitude of what had happened. He had unlocked a door, one that had been carefully closed by the Valari for centuries. The knowledge he had gained wasn't just a linguistic breakthrough. It was the beginning of a profound connection, a bridge between two species who had once been nothing more than distant strangers. And Ryla was starting to see him not as just another human, another curiosity to be studied, but as someone who truly understood her. One evening, after a long day spent observing the Valari, Caden found himself walking through the marketplace alone. The air was thick with the rich scent of Valari spices, and the soft murmur of voices filled the space. As he walked, his mind replayed their earlier conversations. He could feel the walls Ryla had built around herself slowly crumbling, piece by piece, and then, without warning, he heard her voice. "You're walking alone," she said, stepping out from behind a vendor stall. Caden smiled, though he hadn't expected her to be there. "Not really alone, but I'm used to it." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You really don't like being surrounded by people, do you?" Caden glanced around at the bustling marketplace. "It's not that. I just prefer quiet. Helps me think." Ryla's eyes softened, as though she were finally seeing him for who he truly was, not just a human specimen to be examined. "You're different from the others." "Is that a compliment?" Caden asked, raising an eyebrow. Ryla's lips twitched into a small smile, but there was something bittersweet about it. "I don't know. I'm not used to compliments." They walked side by side, the two of them silent for a while as they navigated the busy market. Caden found himself studying Ryla in a new light. She wasn't just the aloof alien he had first encountered. She was someone with her own fears, her own complexities. She wasn't invulnerable, despite the way she carried herself. Finally, Ryla spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You know, you're the first human to speak Valari like that." Caden chuckled lightly. "You make it sound like I'm the first to walk on the moon." She didn't laugh. Instead, she looked at him seriously. "You're the first to understand us the way you do. Most humans don't care to learn. They only want to talk. Or take. But you listen." Caden hesitated. "It's the only way to truly understand someone, don't you think?" Ryla paused, and then nodded slowly. "Maybe." There was an unspoken weight to her words, and Caden could feel it hanging in the air. What Ryla didn't say was just as important as what she did. In her culture, listening wasn't just about hearing words. It was about perceiving the soul beneath them. And in that moment, Caden knew something had changed. They weren't just communicating anymore. They were beginning to connect on a level neither of them had anticipated. As they continued to walk, Caden's thoughts turned to the looming challenges ahead. The Valari weren't just a culture to be understood. They were a species with their own history, their own struggles, and humans had barely scratched the surface. The distrust that had existed between their two peoples had been centuries in the making, and it wouldn't be erased by a few conversations. But this was a start. Do you ever think about what could happen if humans and Valari really understood each other? Caden asked, his voice tentative. Ryla glanced at him, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Every day. Caden looked back at her, his mind racing. What would it take for us to change that? To make sure we don't make the same mistakes again? Ryla paused, considering his question carefully. Trust, she said simply. That's the hardest part, trusting that the other side won't break you. They stopped walking for a moment, and Caden turned to face her fully. You're not wrong, he said quietly, but it has to start somewhere. Ryla's gaze softened, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were seeing him for the first time. Maybe it already has. As the days passed, the connection between Caden and Ryla deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. What had begun as a simple language exchange had transformed into something far more complex, an understanding, an unspoken bond that neither species could have predicted. They had become allies, though not in the traditional sense, but even as their personal relationship grew, Caden knew the stakes were higher than ever. Ryla had begun revealing more about her people, her culture, and the hidden fears that lingered beneath the surface of their carefully constructed society. The Valari weren't just wary of humans. They were terrified of something much darker. One evening, after a particularly long day of joint research and observation, Caden found himself standing by the edge of the outpost, looking out over the barren landscape of Zera 7. The twin suns had set, leaving the sky awash in a deep purple hue. He was deep in thought, reflecting on everything he had learned about the Valari, about their pride, their history, and their ongoing struggles. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Ryla approached, her posture tense, her gaze fixed on the horizon. There was something different about her tonight, something more serious. I have to tell you something, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Caden's pulse quickened. He'd heard that tone before, and he knew it meant that what she was about to say would change everything. He nodded, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. What is it? Ryla glanced around, ensuring they were alone. When she spoke again, her words were measured, careful. The Valari don't just fear humans, we fear the consequences of your actions. Caden frowned, confusion spreading through him. What do you mean? Ryla hesitated before continuing, her voice heavy with the weight of her confession. There are ancient texts, legends, really, that speak of a time when the Valari and another species collided, a species far more advanced than us. They came, and they tried to understand, but they didn't. She paused, and Caden could see the conflict in her eyes. They destroyed us, Ryla finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Caden was taken aback. Destroyed you? How? Ryla looked away, as though the memory of it pained her. They came to Zera 7, long before humans. They were a force so powerful that nothing could stand against them. Their technology was beyond anything we had ever seen. But instead of communicating, instead of learning, they treated us like a lesser species, and in their arrogance, they wiped us out. Our cities, our culture, everything. Caden's mind raced as the gravity of her words sank in. The Valari had suffered a catastrophic event long before humans ever made contact with them. It was no wonder they were so cautious, so distrustful of outsiders. They had seen what could happen when contact went wrong. But there was something else in her eyes now, a flicker of fear, a flicker of something more personal. Ryla, Caden said slowly. What happened to this species? Who were they? Ryla swallowed, hard, and for the first time Caden saw her falter. It wasn't just one species, she said, her voice trembling. It was a group. Humans. Caden's heart skipped a beat. What? Ryla nodded grimly. Not your kind, not yet. But the ones who came before you. The ones who were like you in some ways, but more powerful. They were called the Exiled. And their civilization was lost to time, but their legacy lives on. They left behind warnings for those who would come after, like a scar, a mark upon our history. Caden's mind was reeling. The Exiled? A human-like species that had come and gone? What did this mean for the future of human-Volari relations? And you think we're repeating the same mistakes? He asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil. Inside, Ryla's eyes darkened. I don't think it. I know it. The patterns are the same. The arrogance. The assumption that we are beneath you. That we are just stepping stones to something greater. Caden swallowed. I'm not like that, he said, his voice rising with frustration. I'm trying to understand, not conquer. Ryla met his gaze, her expression softening, but there was still doubt in her eyes. That's what they all say. Until it's too late. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the conversation hung heavily in the air. Finally, Caden broke the silence. We have to prove them wrong, he said, determination hardening his voice. We can't let the mistakes of the past control our future. Ryla studied him for a long time before speaking. Again, her tone more somber. Prove it to me, Caden. Prove that you're different. Prove that humans can learn from history. Caden nodded, his resolve strengthening. I will. It was clear now. The path forward wasn't just about language. It was about trust, about proving that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. It was about showing the Volari that humanity was ready for a different kind of future, a future where peace was possible, but only if they could overcome the shadows of history, and Caden would do whatever it took to make sure that future came to pass. The weight of Ryla's revelation lingered heavily over Caden as the days wore on. The truth about the Exiled, their destructive legacy, had shaken him to his core. He had always known that history shaped the present, but he had never fully grasped how deeply the past could influence a species' future. For the Volari, that past was a haunting specter, a constant reminder of what could happen when trust was broken. But for Caden, it was more than just a revelation. It was a challenge. Prove to Ryla that humanity wasn't like the Exiled. Prove that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. And to do that, he had to dig deeper into the heart of Volari culture, their history, their values, everything that made them who they were. It was an ambitious task, but Caden knew that he couldn't back down. Not now. The next morning he found himself back in the heart of the Volari city. The towering spires and intricate designs that marked the Volari's architecture, standing like silent witnesses to their ancient past. Ryla was there, waiting for him at the central plaza, where the oldest monuments to Volari history stood, symbols of their greatest achievements, but also their darkest failures. As he approached, Ryla didn't greet him with her usual subtle smile or sarcastic remark. Instead, she simply nodded toward the largest of the monuments, an immense stone structure, covered in carvings that told the story of the Volari's ancient history. This is where it all began, Ryla said quietly. Caden followed her gaze. The carvings on the monument depicted scenes of a thriving civilization, the Volari at the height of their power. But as his eyes traveled further down, the images began to shift. He saw the arrival of the Exiled, ships descending from the sky, their presence imposing, their intentions unclear. The next scenes were unsettling: destruction, chaos, and the collapse of an entire society. He turned to Ryla, his voice filled with questions. This is what you fear? Ryla's expression was unreadable as she nodded. This is what we live with. Every day. The fear that, despite everything, despite what we've built. Something or someone will come again, like the exiled, and destroy it all. Caden could feel the raw emotion in her voice, the vulnerability she had always kept hidden. She wasn't just telling him a story of her people's history. She was sharing a piece of her soul, a wound that had never fully healed. I understand, he said, his voice low. But I need you to understand something, too. Ryla raised an eyebrow, clearly curious but guarded. What? I don't want to be like them, Caden said, his tone firm. I'm not here to conquer or control. I'm here to learn, to connect, to help. Ryla studied him for a long moment, her piercing gaze searching for any sign of deception. Caden held her gaze, his resolve unwavering. If we're going to move forward, if there's any hope for peace, it starts with understanding. I'm willing to put in the work, Ryla, but I need you to trust me. The silence between them was thick, almost tangible. Caden wasn't sure if she would ever fully trust him, but he had to try, for both their sakes. Finally, Ryla spoke, her voice softer than before. It's not just about trust, Caden. It's about breaking the cycle. The Volari have been waiting for the other shoe to drop for centuries, and every time it looks like we're safe, we're reminded of how fragile that safety is. We can't afford to make the same mistakes again. Caden nodded solemnly. I get it, but we can't live in fear of the past forever. We have to make our own future. Ryla's gaze softened, just a fraction, and for the first time, Caden saw a glimpse of hope in her eyes. Hope that maybe, just maybe, humanity wasn't doomed to repeat the same mistakes. Over the next few weeks, Caden threw himself into understanding the Volari. He pored over ancient texts, attended cultural rituals, and spent hours speaking with scholars who had dedicated their lives to preserving Volari history. But there was always something holding him back, something that made it difficult for him to fully understand. It was during one of these late-night sessions in the library that Ryla finally addressed what had been on both their minds for some time. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, her voice tinged with hesitation. About making our own future. Caden looked up from the ancient scroll he had been reading, his curiosity piqued. And Ryla's gaze locked with his, intense and direct. I think you're right, but we can't do it alone. You said you wanted to connect. Well, now it's my turn to prove something to you. Caden tilted his head, confused but intrigued. What do you mean? I want to show you something, Ryla said, her tone serious. Something that could change everything. The urgency in her voice caught Caden's attention. Without a word, they left the library together, heading toward the outskirts of the city. Ryla led him to an old, abandoned building, its walls crumbling with age. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the remnants of ancient technology lay scattered across the floor. Caden followed her deeper into the structure, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. And then, in the heart of the building, Ryla stopped. She pointed to a large stone slab that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of debris. With a deep breath, she moved the debris aside, revealing a set of intricate symbols carved into the stone. This, Ryla said quietly, is what we've been hiding. The truth of the exiled and their final message. Caden's heart raced as he knelt beside the slab, studying the symbols. This was more than just a piece of history. It was a key that could unlock everything about the exiled, their downfall, and perhaps the future of the Volari and humanity. But there was a catch. Ryla's voice trembled as she spoke. And you're the only one who can read it, Caden. Caden stood there, his mind racing. The discovery in front of him was nothing short of monumental. The slab of stone, etched with ancient symbols, could hold the key to understanding the exiled, their technology, their downfall, and potentially the path forward for both the Volari and humanity. Ryla's words hung in the air like a challenge. You're the only one who can read it, Caden. But what did that mean? He had never seen these symbols before, yet something in his gut told him he wasn't as unprepared as he thought. The knowledge had to be in him, hidden beneath layers of time, somewhere deep within his mind. It wasn't just an intellectual challenge. It was a test of his character, his resolve, and his commitment to proving to the Volari that humanity was not the same. As the exiled, Ryla's eyes were fixed on him, waiting. Caden could feel the weight of her expectations and the fears of her people pressing down on him. This wasn't just about reading symbols. It was about forging a future. One that could either heal the wounds of the past or reopen them forever. How? Do you know I can read this? Caden asked, his voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. Ryla's answer was simple, because the exiled were human-like. But they weren't the same as you. Their language, their symbols, they're rooted in something that humans like you have seen before. Something in your genetic memory. You just need to unlock it. Caden's heart skipped. The connection Ryla was making between the exiled and human potential was profound. Could he really have this hidden knowledge? Could humanity's past somehow be woven into his very DNA, waiting to be accessed? He stared at the stone, unsure of what would happen next. But the need to understand, to connect, was overwhelming. If he could read this, if he could finally bridge the divide between the Volari and humans, everything would change. Taking a deep breath, Caden placed his hands gently on the slab. For a moment, nothing happened. The symbols were intricate, like nothing he'd seen before. A complex web of lines and curves. Yet, as his fingers traced the edges, a strange sensation swept over him, an odd sense of familiarity, as if these shapes were not entirely alien to him. He felt something stir deep within, a flicker of recognition. The symbols began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. His mind flashed with images. Images of ancient cities, of ships in the sky, and of a species on the brink of extinction. The exiled had once been like humanity, Caden realized, but something had gone terribly wrong. And this stone, this message, held the answer. Without thinking, Caden began to speak, his voice steady as he read the ancient symbols aloud. The words came to him naturally, as if they had always been there, waiting. To those who follow, heed our warning. We were once like you, but our pride led to our downfall. We reached for the stars without understanding the cost. We left behind nothing but ash. Do not repeat our mistakes. Do not become what we were. As the last words left his lips, the glow of the stone faded. Caden's head spun as the weight of the message settled in. The exiled had known the cost of their ambition. Their technology, their power, had been their undoing. And now, they were warning humanity. They were warning the Volari. But what did this mean for the future? Caden stood up, his knees feeling weak. Ryla was watching him, her eyes wide with both awe and fear. She had seen him unlock the past, but was that enough to shape the future? Do you understand it now? She asked softly. Caden nodded, his mind still processing the full extent of what he had uncovered. I think so. The exiled weren't just a threat. They were a warning. They were us. Or rather, they could have been us if we made the same mistakes. We can't just reach for the stars. We have to understand the consequences of our actions, and we can't let that arrogance blind us. Ryla's gaze softened, but there was still a shadow of doubt in her eyes. So, you understand. But will humanity listen? Will you prove that you can learn? Caden turned to face her fully, his voice filled with newfound conviction. I don't know if humanity will listen, but I'll do everything in my power to make them. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the future. It's about making sure we don't become the exiled. Ryla's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, a glimmer of hope. She didn't speak immediately, but Caden could tell that the seeds of trust were starting to take root. She was beginning to believe in him, in humanity's ability to change. Together they carefully left the ruins, leaving the slab behind. But the weight of the discovery was far from gone. They were not done yet. The message had been unlocked, but the path ahead remained uncertain. There was still so much to learn, so much to prove. As they walked back toward the Volari city, Caden's thoughts raced. Could the Volari ever truly trust humanity? Could they overcome their fear and let go of the past? And more importantly, could humanity rise to the challenge? Could they prove that they were ready for the stars? One thing was certain: their future, and the future of the Volari, now depended on the choices they made in the coming days. The days following the discovery were a blur of meetings, discussions, and preparations. The message from the exiled had shaken both Caden and Ryla to their cores. What had once seemed like a path to understanding now felt like a race against time. The Valari had their history, and humanity had its potential. But could they reconcile the two without repeating the mistakes of the past? Caden felt the pressure mounting. The Valari had always feared the rise of another exiled faction, a species that would reach for the stars with reckless abandon, believing themselves invincible. The exiled had paid the ultimate price for their pride, and now the Valari were left with the scars, the trauma, and the lessons that had shaped them. But what Caden had uncovered in the hidden texts, the final warning, was more than just a lesson in hubris. It was a challenge to humanity itself. He had shown them that humanity had the potential to learn from its mistakes, that they could rise above the arrogance that had destroyed civilizations before them. But that didn't mean they would. Humanity had a choice. And with that choice, the future of both species hung in the balance. Caden sat with Ryla in a quiet room, the weight of their discovery pressing on them both. The time had come for them to speak to the Council of the Valari, the ruling body that would decide the fate of the Alliance, the fate of humanity's future. Among the stars. "Are you ready?" Ryla asked quietly, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. Caden met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I've never been more ready. But I know this won't be easy. The Valari have been living in fear for so long. We're asking them to trust again, to take a leap of faith." Ryla nodded, but her brow furrowed with concern. "It's not just trust. The Valari have to believe that humanity can change. They've seen our history. They know what we're capable of. The question is, can we show them we're different? Can we prove to them that we're not the exiled?" Caden stood, pacing the room. The council would be a challenge. They had their doubts, their fears, and their pride. The Valari had built an empire, and they had no intention of letting a race of humans, no matter how well-intentioned, endanger it. Yet Caden knew that the Valari had a deep desire for peace. They just had to be shown that it was possible. "We don't have to prove everything," Caden said, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "We just have to show them that we're willing to take the first step, to demonstrate that we can learn from our mistakes and that we're capable of forging a future without fear of repeating the past." Ryla's eyes softened. "And what if they don't believe us? What if they're too scared to take that risk?" Caden stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Then we'll keep showing them. Over and over again. We'll prove it through our actions, not just our words. We can't change everything overnight, but we can start." Ryla smiled faintly. "You're right. But the Valari don't trust easily, Caden. They need more than promises. They need to see results." "And they'll see them," Caden replied confidently. "The future isn't something we can predict, but it's something we can build, together." The day of the council arrived, and the air was thick with tension. The massive chamber was filled with Valari leaders, their regal presence commanding respect as they gathered to discuss the fate of the Human-Valari Alliance. Caden and Ryla stood before them, ready to present their findings, their case, and their vision for the future. The room fell silent as the head of the council, a dignified elder named Valus, addressed them. His voice was grave, each word carrying the weight of centuries of tradition and history. "We have heard your words, human, and we have seen what you've uncovered. But the question remains, are you truly different from the exiled? Can you prove that humanity will not repeat their mistakes?" Caden stepped forward, his heart racing, but his voice unwavering. "We can't erase the past, but we can control our future. The exiled made their choice, and it destroyed them. We've seen what happens when we forget the consequences of our actions. But we have learned. We have the knowledge and the will to change. And we're asking you to take that leap of faith with us." Ryla stood beside him, her voice calm but resolute. "The exiled were destroyed by their pride. We have learned the cost of unchecked ambition. Together, we can build something better, something that will last." There was a long pause. The Valari leaders exchanged glances, murmurs of uncertainty rippling through the room. Caden could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, hope, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, humanity was capable of something different. Finally, Vali spoke again, his voice steady but filled with a deep sadness. You ask us to trust you, to trust humanity, to trust that the future will not repeat the past. It is a difficult request, and one that we are not sure we can make, but perhaps we have no choice. The room was silent as the council deliberated, weighing the options. After what felt like an eternity, Valis stood once more, his eyes meeting Caden's with a mixture of resolve and uncertainty. We will take the first step with you, human. We will join you in building this future. But know this. Should you fail, should humanity fall into the same trap as the exiled, there will be no second chance. Caden nodded, understanding the gravity of the decision. We won't fail. And with that, the decision was made. The Valari would take a chance on humanity, would join them in the great experiment of coexistence, of mutual trust, and of building a future that neither species had ever dared to imagine. As Caden left the council chamber, he turned to Ryla, a sense of accomplishment swelling in his chest. They had done it. They had taken the first step. Ryla looked at him with a mixture of pride and wariness. It's just the beginning, Caden. We've convinced them, but the hard part is still ahead. Caden smiled, the weight of the future heavy but clear in his mind. I know, but we're not alone in this anymore. As they stood together, staring out at the horizon, the stars above seemed to whisper of possibilities, of a future where two species, scarred by the mistakes of their pasts, could learn from each other and rise together. It was a fragile hope, but it was theirs. And for the first time, Caden truly believed that maybe, just maybe, humanity was ready to reach for the stars, not with pride, but with the wisdom to carry the weight of that ambition. The future, uncertain and full of potential, had begun.